She won't see it coming.
For 11 years, I made his coffee every morning at 6:15. I never touched his phone, until the night I heard him whisper 4 words into it that changed everything. She won't see it coming. This is what happens when you underestimate the woman making your coffee. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what he planned, what he didn't know I'd already found, and how she turned his own trap into her freedom. My name, for the purposes of this story, is Sarah Whitman, and the man I married, Michael Whitman, believed he knew every version of me there was. He was wrong, and it would take him nearly a decade to understand exactly how wrong. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Sarah Whitman grew up in a small town outside Columbus, Ohio, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business, and where a woman's worth was often measured by how well she kept her home. She was the second of 3 daughters, raised by a mother who taught her to sew, to cook, and above all, to be agreeable. Her father worked at a manufacturing plant for 30 years and rarely spoke unless spoken to first. Sarah learned early that peace in a household often depended on how much of herself she was willing to fold away. She was smart, quietly so, the kind of student who scored well on tests but never raised her hand. She wanted to study accounting. Her guidance counselor told her nursing was a more practical choice for a girl who would likely marry young. She listened, because that was what she had been taught to do. She met Michael Whitman at 22, at a community college night class in business communications. He was charming in the way that confident, ambitious men often are, quick with compliments, quicker with plans for the future. He talked about opening his own consulting firm one day, about buying a house with a wraparound porch, about children who would grow up with more opportunities than either of them had. Sarah found herself drawn not just to him, but to the version of her life he described, a life that sounded stable, secure, and finally, respected. Within 8 months they were engaged. Her mother cried at the news, calling it a blessing. Her older sister, quieter about her doubts, asked Sarah once if she was certain. Sarah said yes, because by then she had already convinced herself that certainty was simply a feeling you built through repetition. They married in a small Methodist church when Sarah was 23, Michael was 26, freshly hired at a regional financial services company, eager to prove himself. The first few years were, by most accounts, happy ones. They rented a modest 2-bedroom apartment, then bought a starter home in a quiet subdivision once Michael's commissions began to grow. Sarah worked part-time at a dentist's office, doing billing and reception, but the arrangement shifted once their first child, a daughter named Emily, was born. Michael suggested Sarah stay home, at least for a while, and Sarah agreed, telling herself it was temporary. A second child, a son named Jacob, arrived 3 years later. By then, temporary had quietly become permanent, and Sarah's entire financial identity existed inside the shape of her husband's paycheck. It was somewhere around year 6 of the marriage that the small changes began, the kind so subtle that Sarah, looking back later, would struggle to pinpoint exactly when they started. Michael began working later. He started taking calls in the garage with the door shut. He grew irritated when Sarah asked simple questions about bills, questions she had every right to ask, since her name was on the mortgage too. He began referring to their joint accounts as my accounts, in passing conversation, a slip Sarah noticed but did not confront, because confrontation in that house had never gone well for her. Instead, she adapted, the way she had adapted her whole life. She kept the coffee ready at 6:15 every morning. She kept the house immaculate, and she kept her questions to herself, filing them away in a place she did not yet know she would eventually need. By year 9, Sarah had noticed something else. Michael had started using a different phrase around the house, one he likely did not realize he repeated so often. He would say, almost lightly, "You wouldn't understand the numbers," whenever Sarah asked about investments, about the business accounts tied to his growing consulting side work, about a life insurance policy renewal notice she had once seen arrive in the mail and then never saw again. Sarah began to understand that being kept in the dark was not an accident. It was a strategy, quiet and deliberate, built over years, one dismissive comment at a time. She began, without fully admitting it to herself, to pay closer attention. She started remembering dates. She started remembering names mentioned in passing, half heard on phone calls, names she was never formally introduced to. There was a woman's name that came up more than once. A colleague, Michael said, someone named Dana, who apparently handled client relations at his firm. Sarah noticed the name because of how carefully Michael avoided elaborating on her whenever it slipped into conversation. She noticed how his phone, once left carelessly on the kitchen counter for years, had begun disappearing into his pocket the moment he entered a room. She noticed a new passcode on a device that had never needed one before. None of these things taken alone proved anything. Sarah was careful never to let herself leap to conclusions, because she understood, better than most, how easily a woman's suspicion could be dismissed as jealousy, insecurity, or an overactive imagination. She decided, instead, to simply watch and to wait. The night that changed everything came on an unremarkable Tuesday in late October. Michael had come home late from what he called a client dinner, distracted, short with the children, and short with Sarah when she asked how his evening went. He went upstairs earlier than usual, and Sarah, cleaning up in the kitchen below, heard his voice drift down the hallway, low and careful, the tone of a man who believed he was alone. She moved closer, not because she intended to spy, she would tell herself later, but because something in his voice made the hair on her arms stand up. And that was when she heard it, 4 words spoken with a calm that chilled her far more than anger would have. "She won't see it coming." Sarah froze in the hallway, coffee mug still in hand, and in that instant, 11 years of small, dismissed suspicions rearranged themselves into something that finally made sense. She did not confront him that night. She had learned, over a decade of marriage, that timing mattered more than emotion, that a woman who reacted too quickly often lost the advantage of surprise. Instead, Sarah went to bed beside her husband as though nothing had happened, staring at the ceiling while he slept soundly beside her, untroubled, unaware that his wife had just heard the one sentence that would unravel everything he had spent years quietly building. She lay awake, replaying the tone of his voice, the certainty in it, the phrase, "she won't see it coming," turning it over and over, trying to determine whether the she in question was Sarah herself or someone else entirely. By morning, she had made a decision. She would not ask him directly. She would find out on her own, carefully, patiently, the same way he had apparently been planning against her. The following week, Sarah began paying attention to details she had once let pass. She noticed a business card tucked inside Michael's coat pocket while doing laundry, the name of a family law attorney printed in clean, deliberate font, an attorney whose office was 2 towns over, far enough that no one in their small community would likely recognize the name. She said nothing, but she memorized it. A few days later, while helping Michael search for a missing document, she came across a locked metal filing cabinet in the corner of his home office, one she had walked past 1,000 times without a second thought. It had never been locked before, now it was, and Michael brushed off her question about the change with an offhand comment about organizing old files, a phrase that, coming from a man who had never organized anything voluntarily in his life, struck Sarah as deeply unconvincing. Sarah began her own quiet investigation, not out of vengeance, but out of the simple, exhausting need to finally understand her own life. She started with the family laptop, an old device Michael rarely used anymore since switching almost entirely to his phone. Buried in an old email folder, she found a message from months earlier, a forwarded confirmation for a financial planning consultation, the kind typically scheduled by people preparing for a significant life transition, such as a divorce. The email referenced asset protection strategies and separate account structuring, language that meant little to Sarah at first glance, but which she copied down carefully in a notebook she began keeping hidden inside a shoebox of old baby clothes, a place she knew Michael would never think to look, since sentimental clutter had never interested him. Over the following weeks, Sarah's notebook grew. She learned to check the family banking app during the narrow windows when Michael left it open on the shared tablet, and she noticed a new savings account she did not recognize, its balance visible for only a moment before Michael, catching her glance, quickly closed the app and made an excuse about a work-related error. The balance, blurred by the speed of the screen, but not fast enough to escape her memory entirely, was substantial, far more than their household had any right to be quietly accumulating without her knowledge. Sarah did not confront him. She wrote the figure down instead, along with the date, the time, and the excuse he had given, building, page by page, a record that would one day matter far more than any argument she could have had with him in the heat of the moment. Sarah began to understand, slowly and with growing clarity, that Michael was not simply hiding money out of habit or discomfort with financial conversations. He was preparing, methodically, for an ending he had not yet announced to her. She thought back to the attorney's business card, to the newly locked filing cabinet, to the hushed phone call behind a closed bedroom door, and to the 4 words that had started it all. She realized that somewhere in the last year, her husband had decided their marriage was over, and rather than telling her, rather than affording her the basic decency of an honest conversation, he had chosen instead to build a quiet financial fortress designed to leave her with as little as possible when the moment finally came. The realization did not make her cry, not right away. Instead, it made her remarkably, unsettlingly calm. It was Sarah's younger sister, Rachel, who first suggested she speak to someone qualified to help her understand what she was seeing. Rachel had gone through her own difficult divorce 2 years earlier and recommended a family law attorney she trusted, a woman named Patricia Doyle, known locally for representing clients in complicated asset cases. Sarah hesitated for weeks before making the call, terrified of what it would mean to formally acknowledge, out loud, to a stranger, that her marriage might be ending. When she finally sat across from Patricia's desk, laying out her notebook, the dates, the balances, the attorney's business card she had photographed with her own phone, Patricia's expression shifted from polite professionalism to something sharper, more focused. "This isn't paranoia," Patricia told her. "This is a pattern, and patterns like this usually mean someone has already started building a case against you." Patricia explained, in careful terms, what Sarah's evidence suggested. Michael appeared to be engaging in a practice, sometimes called financial infidelity, quietly diverting shared income into accounts Sarah had no access to, potentially in preparation for a divorce filing that would attempt to minimize what Sarah could claim. The locked filing cabinet likely contained documentation of these transfers, along with, Patricia suspected, records meant to paint Sarah in an unflattering light, perhaps exaggerated claims about spending habits, parenting shortcomings, or instability, the kind of narrative a less scrupulous attorney might use to argue for reduced spousal support or custody limitations. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach at the thought that her own husband might be constructing a false portrait of her, one designed to be believed by a judge who had never met her, based on years of a marriage he alone controlled the story of. Patricia advised Sarah to do exactly what she had already begun doing instinctively, to document everything, carefully and without confrontation, before Michael had any indication she was aware of his plans. She recommended Sarah open a private email account Michael did not know existed, forward relevant information to herself in small, unremarkable increments, and begin quietly consulting with a financial advisor of her own to understand the full scope of the couple's actual assets, many of which Sarah realized she had never been shown in full. Patricia also gently suggested Sarah consider her own safety and stability first, recommending she speak with a therapist, not because anything Michael had done so far was violent, but because the psychological toll of discovering a decade of quiet deception was, in itself, a serious weight to carry. Sarah began seeing a therapist named Dr. Linda Marsh every other week, initially reluctant to spend the money without Michael noticing, until Patricia reminded her that self-preservation was not something she needed to apologize for. In those sessions, Sarah began to unpack not just the discovery of Michael's plans, but the years leading up to it, the small dismissals, the financial control disguised as simplicity, the way she had slowly been taught that her judgment mattered less than his. Dr. Marsh helped her see the pattern clearly for the first time, not as a single betrayal, but as a slow erosion that had been happening since long before that Tuesday night in the hallway. Sarah began to understand that whatever Michael was planning, she was no longer willing to be the passive figure in her own story. Meanwhile, life at home continued its careful performance. Sarah still made coffee every morning at 6:15. She still packed lunches for Emily and Jacob, still asked Michael about his day, still played the role of a wife who suspected nothing, because Patricia had been clear that the element of surprise was, at this stage, Sarah's greatest advantage. Michael, for his part, seemed increasingly distracted, occasionally short-tempered, occasionally almost too kind, the kind of overcorrected warmth Sarah recognized as guilt dressed up as affection. She wondered, some nights, whether Dana from his office was more than a colleague, whether the plan he was building had less to do with money alone and more to do with a life he intended to start somewhere else, with someone else, once the financial groundwork was complete. It was nearly 2 months after the hallway conversation that Sarah found the piece of evidence that changed the shape of everything. While Michael was traveling for a supposed work conference, Sarah, working with a locksmith Patricia had discreetly recommended, opened the filing cabinet in his home office. Inside, she found exactly what Patricia had warned her about: printed bank statements from the hidden account, a partially drafted divorce petition with blank spaces where Sarah's name and their assets would eventually be filled in, and, most disturbing of all, a folder labeled with Sarah's name containing notes, dates, and exaggerated claims about arguments and incidents that had either never happened or had been dramatically distorted from Sarah's memory of them. It was, Patricia later confirmed, the foundation of a custody and financial strategy designed to paint Sarah as unstable and undeserving. Sarah photographed every page methodically, careful to return each document to its exact original position, exactly as Patricia had instructed her. She felt her hands shake, not from fear this time, but from something closer to fury, quiet and controlled. She thought of her wedding ring, still on her finger at that moment, and later that night, after the children were asleep, she placed it on the kitchen counter, not as a dramatic gesture for anyone to witness, but simply because she could no longer stand the weight of it. While she stood in a house built, she now understood clearly, on a lie of shared partnership that had quietly stopped being true years earlier. She did not cry that night either. She simply sat at the kitchen table and began writing out, in careful detail, everything she now knew. Patricia reviewed the photographed documents with visible concern, explaining that Michael's plan appeared far more calculated than even she had initially suspected. The fabricated notes about Sarah's supposed instability, combined with the hidden accounts, suggested Michael intended not simply to leave the marriage, but to leave it in a way that stripped Sarah of both financial security and, potentially, meaningful custody of her own children. Patricia explained that this kind of premeditated strategy, if proven, could actually work significantly in Sarah's favor once it was formally presented in court, since judges tend to view evidence of deliberate financial concealment and fabricated character claims as serious red flags regarding a petitioner's credibility and intentions. In trying to protect himself completely, Michael had inadvertently built the very case that could unravel his own position. Over the next several weeks, Sarah worked closely with Patricia and a forensic financial analyst to trace the full extent of the hidden accounts, eventually uncovering transfers totaling just under $200,000 diverted over the course of nearly 3 years. Funneled through what appeared to be a shell consulting arrangement Michael had quietly established under a business name Sarah had never heard him mention. The analyst explained that these transfers, timed and structured the way they were, strongly suggested deliberate concealment rather than ordinary business expenses, a distinction that would matter greatly once the case moved forward. Sarah, sitting in Patricia's office reviewing the spreadsheet of transactions, felt a strange, unexpected calm settle over her, the quiet satisfaction of finally holding proof of something she had spent a decade being told she was imagining. Sarah made the decision, with Patricia's guidance, to file first. Rather than waiting for Michael to spring his own carefully prepared divorce petition, Sarah's legal team filed on her behalf, presenting the court with documentation of hidden marital assets, the fabricated character notes discovered in the filing cabinet, and a clear financial timeline built by the forensic analyst. Michael, blindsided by a filing he had not seen coming, despite having spent months preparing for exactly this outcome, reportedly became visibly shaken when served with the papers at his office, a detail Sarah later learned from a mutual acquaintance who witnessed the moment. The 4 words he had once whispered into his phone in a quiet upstairs hallway now applied, with an irony neither of them could have predicted, far more accurately to himself. The following months brought a long, difficult legal process, one that tested Sarah's patience and resolve at nearly every turn. Michael's attorney initially attempted to argue that the fabricated notes about Sarah were simply private journaling, unrelated to any deliberate legal strategy, but Patricia methodically dismantled that argument by presenting the dated bank transfers alongside the notes, demonstrating a clear pattern of preparation that stretched back nearly 3 years. Michael, for his part, oscillated between attempts at reconciliation, showing up at the house uninvited to apologize, and flashes of anger when he realized the leverage he had once believed he held was rapidly disappearing. Sarah, guided by both Patricia and Dr. Marsh, maintained a steady composure throughout, refusing to be drawn into arguments that would have once, years earlier, ended with her quietly backing down. During the proceedings, it was also revealed, through discovery, that Michael's relationship with his colleague Dana had, in fact, moved beyond professional boundaries in the final year of the marriage, a fact he had denied when Sarah's attorney first raised it, but which text records eventually confirmed. For Sarah, this revelation landed with less shock than she expected, a quiet confirmation of something she had already sensed for months, rather than a devastating new betrayal. What affected her far more deeply, she later admitted in therapy, was not the affair itself, but the calculated, years-long effort to leave her with nothing, to control not just the ending of their marriage, but the entire narrative surrounding it, a level of premeditation that spoke to something far colder than infidelity alone. The court ultimately ruled substantially in Sarah's favor, citing the deliberate concealment of marital assets and the fabricated documentation intended to undermine Sarah's credibility. The judge awarded her a significantly larger share of the couple's combined assets than she likely would have received under a standard settlement, along with primary custody of Emily and Jacob, with Michael granted structured visitation. The judge's written opinion specifically noted that a party's attempt to manipulate legal proceedings through fabricated evidence reflected poorly on their overall credibility and intentions throughout the marriage. Sarah remembered sitting in the courtroom as the ruling was read, thinking not of victory exactly, but of a strange, hard-earned relief, the sense of a decade-long silence finally being given the last word it deserved. In the months following the finalized divorce, Sarah rebuilt her life carefully, deliberately, in much the same methodical way she had once uncovered Michael's plans against her. She returned to school part-time, finally pursuing the accounting degree she had set aside at 22, using a portion of her settlement to cover tuition while continuing therapy with Dr. Marsh. Emily and Jacob adjusted slowly to their new routine, and Sarah made a point of never speaking ill of their father in front of them. A restraint Patricia had advised, and one Sarah found, surprisingly, easier to maintain than she expected, since her focus had shifted almost entirely toward building something new, rather than dwelling on what had been taken from her. Michael, according to those who remained in contact with him, struggled considerably in the years following the divorce. His relationship with Dana reportedly did not survive the fallout of the court proceedings, and his professional reputation suffered once details of the hidden accounts became known within his small industry circle. Sarah, for her part, avoided seeking out information about his life, focused instead on her own, though she occasionally heard updates through mutual friends who insisted on sharing them, despite her polite disinterest. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she felt no particular satisfaction in his struggles, only a quiet sense of closure, the understanding that whatever he had once planned for her had ultimately cost him far more than it ever could have cost her. 2 years after the divorce was finalized, Sarah completed her accounting degree and accepted a position at a mid-sized firm in Columbus, work she found genuinely fulfilling in a way she had rarely experienced during her years at home. She still made coffee every morning, though now it was only ever for herself and, on weekend mornings, for Emily and Jacob, who had grown increasingly comfortable in their new, quieter household. Sarah kept the old notebook from the shoebox, the one filled with dates, balances, and quiet observations, tucked away in a drawer, not out of bitterness, but as a reminder of exactly how much she had been capable of when she finally stopped waiting for someone else to tell her the truth about her own life. Looking back, Sarah often said that the 4 words she overheard that October night were not, in the end, a threat that succeeded, but a warning she was fortunate enough to hear in time. Michael had believed, for years, that the woman who quietly made his coffee every morning was too occupied with small domestic routines to notice the architecture being built around her, piece by careful piece, designed to leave her with nothing. He had underestimated the very thing that ultimately protected her, the patience she had spent a lifetime learning, and the sharp, careful attention she had spent 11 years quietly perfecting, without him ever once realizing it was there. In the end, the woman he thought would never see it coming was the only one who saw everything clearly, long before he did. If this story resonated with you, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more true stories like this one every week.